Uh, Dr. Narango's presentation tonight on cultivating backyard habitat follows many years of study at Ohio State University, the University of Delaware, and as a fellow with the U.S. Forest Service, and now as a research scientist at the Vermont Center for Ecosystem Studies. Dr. Narango is not only a force in the scientific world, but also important in encouraging each of us to make the simple steps that will support our native birds, butterflies, and bees. Her focus tonight will be on our pollinators and the things we can and must do all year to assure they survive and thrive. I know you're all anxious to hear her, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Desiree Narango.
Thanks, Donna. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm seeing people like streaming in. And I'm like, holy cow, this is great. What an amazing audience. I've been looking forward to talking to the Pollinator Pathways folks for a long time. So I'm really happy that you're here this evening to hear what I have to say. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So you should be able to see some beautiful pollinators and some backyard habitat. Louise, let me know if we're not. But so tonight, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of my research and really kind of focus in on some of our work that's pointed to how the simple decisions that we make in backyard habitat can really affect pollinators. And I put backyard habitat here, but we can really think about all kinds of different novel and unique green spaces in our urban and suburban areas, and the potential that these habitats have for really supporting our insect and our pollinator diversity. And so, I hope tonight that you'll get some ideas and some inspiration, especially if you're getting into the doldrums of fall and winter, like I am up here in Vermont. You're thinking about, well, what can I do and what kind of plans can I make for this winter or next spring or next summer? And I hope that this talk will give you some inspiration and some ideas that are also data driven and backed by science. And so, but before I get started, Donna mentioned, so right now I'm a conservation scientist at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. And if you haven't heard of this organization before, we are a nonprofit in Vermont, but we're really a unique organization in that we focus on research that can inform conservation. And a lot of our work is really our goals are to unite people in science for conservation, both by providing information that you can use to make decisions, but also to engage people in the process of science through community participatory science as well, or citizen science. And so if you're interested in those sort of things, or you're interested in anything that I talk about with you tonight, I encourage you to check out our website, find out about some of the projects that we have both in the Northeast and beyond. And of course, if you have any questions about anything that I talk about here, my email is always open. You're welcome to contact me at any time. So on to the information, and I promise you that this is the only depressing slide that I have here today. But you may be aware, possibly through our headlines or papers or popular articles, that we are currently in a worldwide biodiversity crisis. And it's extreme. We are facing losing species across the world, such that there are estimates that as many as 1 million different species are at risk of extinction. And we see headlines like the insect apocalypse, the 6th mass extinction. We've lost 3 billion birds, that's billion with a B, in the last 50 years or so. It's extremely alarming. And sometimes it can make you feel like, what can I do? What kind of action could I actually take to revert some of these declines? And I'm here to tell you that there's something that we can do. It's clear that we need to do something. And then my job as a conservation scientist, that's where I really come in, is to try to understand and to identify and to measure what these conservation solutions are. And so I've focused much of my research program over more than a decade of work focusing on human-dominated land uses. If we think about human-dominated land uses, we could say, well, gee, that's basically everywhere. Oh, wait. Oh, geez, this went ahead, didn't it? But I'm really thinking about these novel and cultivated land uses where people are making primary decisions to and how they manage these habitats. And these habitats have a lot of potential for climate adaptation, for social benefits, and for biodiversity conservation. But we need to be making those right decisions in order to get those benefits. In order to make those decisions, we need to first study them. And we also need to provide that information for people that they can use in their decision making, while also taking into account your needs and your values. So that's really what I focus on as a conservation scientist. A lot of my work is focused on land uses such as forest and pocket parks, gardens, roadside verges, community agriculture, and much of my work is really focused on residential yards across the United States. And there's a good reason for focusing on residential yards. In fact, we had a paper that came out recently that showed that if we really take into account what residential yards actually are, not just urban, but suburban and rural areas or homesteads, if we, oh, I think I might have my timing on. I'm gonna stop for 1 second just to see if I can fix this real quick. Hold on 1 second. Oh, I did have timings on. I just got back from vacation, folks, so you'll have to forgive me here.
We will forgive you.
Oh boy. Okay. Where's my Zoom? Let's open up this. Let's share our screen. Let's go back ahead. All right. So recently we had a paper that came out where we quantified residential yards across the United States. And we found that some of our estimates were much, much higher than what was previously quantified. In fact, residential yards can make up about 30% of the United States when we think about all the different land uses that are out there, our urban, our suburban, and our rural land uses. The other thing that we found is that when we look into the literature, that yards can really create conservation success stories. And one of my favorite success stories is the one of the Atala butterfly. The Atala butterfly was a species that we thought was previously extinct. Until folks, gardeners across the Southeast started to plant its favorite host plant, the Kunti plant. It just got really popular in horticulture just because people really liked it. And as people started to plant the host plant of this Atala butterfly, lo and behold, the butterfly was never extinct. It was always there, just at low abundances. And instead of being a rare threatened species, it exploded and it was able to thrive just because of the simple decisions that those homeowners make. But if we dig a little deeper, we can find lots of other conservation success stories, such as orchids in Miami. Some of my own work has shown that backyards and residential properties can support habitat for migratory birds and other breeding species like wood thrush, Baltimore oriole. In the Midwest, we can see examples of yards and other suburban green spaces having habitat for populations of our endangered bumblebee species, the rusty patched bumblebee. And we see lots of different examples like this. But we know that not all yards are supporting these species. And so we need a better understanding of what those specific features and mechanisms are that lead to that high quality habitat. Why does this yard support this pollinator, but this yard doesn't. One of the mechanisms that I've really focused a lot of my research attention on is plant communities and the plant decisions that people make. And that's because one of the primary ways that you're managing all of your pollinator pathways is in the decisions that you make on the plants that are cultivated there. If you're thinking about your yard, we can think about the choices that the developer made on what trees to leave behind when they originally made your neighborhood, which ones to cut down. You can plant new species, you can design gardens, you can choose how often that you want to mow. Each one of these seemingly small decisions has had the additive effect of completely transforming the plant communities that have survived to occupy the present day. But when I first got into this research, it was very apparent that we knew surprisingly little about how those decisions in plant cultivation that people are making, how they have cascading impacts on the rest of the biodiversity, such as the birds and the insects that are able to use those habitats. And so I've focused a lot of my research program on trying to better understand these decisions. If the rest of my talk is really going to focus on the information that I found in my research and in my investigations of natural history of insects and how we can support pollinator conservation. If you turn off your ears for the rest of the talk, I'd be okay with that. But I want you to remember, this is the most important thing that I want you to remember, is that pollinator conservation needs more than just flowers. If you are just planting more flowers out in the landscape, that's not going to solve our conservation problem and our pollinator decline issues. It really has to do with what kinds of flowers that you're planting, the traits of those flowers, and whether you're planting for other stages of the natural cycle of these insects as well. I really want to focus in on thinking about pollinator conservation from the perspective of the full annual cycle. And when we say the full annual cycle, that means creating habitat and supporting each stage that that insect needs to go to in order to survive, become an adult, reproduce, and start the next generation of insects. And we can use the monarch butterfly as an example of this. So this is maybe one that you're familiar with, where the female monarch butterfly, she lays her eggs on her host plant. That egg hatches and the caterpillars come out and they feed on that host plant. We also need to support habitat for that caterpillar to pupate in order to go through metamorphosis and then eventually become that butterfly. And so in order to have a population of monarch butterflies, we need to have the host plants for those specialists. We need to have the nectar and the pollen plants for those adults. We also need to support the nesting and the overwintering habitat for many species as well. And just like the monarch butterfly, we can see these same kinds of full annual cycle needs for other kinds of pollinators, such as our bumblebees. So for example, when you're in the spring and you see lots of bumblebees flying around, kind of searching, many of those bumblebees are queens that are searching for locations in order to initiate their colony. Once they find that location to raise their brood, they're going to start laying those eggs so that those workers can hatch out. Those are the ones that go out and look for pollen that they can then bring back to the colony. They need nectar in order to survive and move around. More workers are hatching out. And then eventually at the end of the season, we have new queens that emerge from that colony, and they need to find a location in order to spend the winter. And those queens are the ones that initiate the colonies next year. And so again, just like the monarch butterfly, we need to have plants for these bees to have pollen, plants for these bees to have nectar, locations for these bees to nest, and also locations for them to overwinter as well. And so these are really kind of the three features of your yard that I'm focusing on this talk is host plants for specialists, nectar and pollen plants for those flower visitors, and nesting and overwintering habitat. So the first part I want to talk about here is planting host plants for butterfly and moth caterpillars. And I mentioned the monarch butterfly, but just to remind everybody that the reason that a lot of folks have really pushed these efforts to plant milkweed in our gardens is because milkweed, the genus Asclepius, is the only genus of plant that monarch butterflies can complete their life cycle on. And so these females are laying their eggs on these milkweed plants. The caterpillars are feeding on those milkweed plants. Those are the only ones that they can feed on in order to eventually pupate and become that monarch butterfly. It's something that you may have learned in elementary school. My 8-year-old talks about it all the time. That's great. But what we don't learn necessarily in elementary school is that specialization that we observe in the monarch butterfly is not the exception. It's actually the rule. And that if you look in your yard, these are all butterflies that I took pictures of when I was in my yard in Massachusetts. These are all butterflies that could visit my garden, but for every single flower visiting butterfly that we observe in that garden, all of them spend the majority of their life cycle, and arguably the most important part of their life cycle, as a plant-eating caterpillar. And they all are very, very specialized to particular host plants in order to complete that life cycle, every single one. And you can't have any of those butterflies unless you're able to support them during their caterpillar stage as well. In fact, if we look at different arthropods across our groups, all these pollinators and beneficial insects, we find that more than 90% of our plant-eating insects are specialists to some degree. Our caterpillars, our beetles, our leafhoppers, and even our bees as well. And what that means is that over evolutionary time, these insects have specialized to feed on very particular host plants, that they've overcome those nasty defensive chemical compounds that are found in the leaf, but they also adapt to the timing or the phenology of that plant. And they adapt to what that plant looks like as well, so that they can recognize it in the landscape. And so a really nice example that I like to share is in the upper right here. This is the double-toothed prominent caterpillar. It's a specialist of elm trees. And you can see that for this caterpillar, it blends in really nicely with that double-tooth shape of an elm tree as well. And that's so that it can hide from those visual predators like songbirds. And so it really depends on those elm trees, not just because they can feed on it and grow and thrive, but also because that's the best plant for them to hide from as well. And so one of the questions that many people have asked themselves, maybe your neighbors, maybe you have been asking yourself about what kind of plants that you have in your gardens, is whether to plant native or non-native species. And so we can look at the numbers of different caterpillar species that have evolved to use certain host plants, and we can look at those raw numbers and make some comparisons. And so these are some numbers for the Northeast. We have our group of plants like our oak trees that are supporting about 477 different species. I believe these are numbers for Vermont. And then for our goldenrods, we have, they're supporting about 131 different species of caterpillars. So this is the top performing woody plant, our oak trees, and the top performing herbaceous plant, our goldenrods, for the East. We can compare that with the numbers for some of our popular non-native species that are out there, like our ginkgo trees, which is a popular street tree across many cities in the United States. But when we look at the host plant literature, we find that ginkgo trees have really only been documented as supporting about 6 different species of caterpillar. And honestly, if we look at those 6 species, they are those few caterpillars that can feed just on just about anything. And they happen to also feed on ginkgos. But there's a whole host, if you go to your local nursery or a Home Depot or Lowe's, and you see all of these popular annuals and some perennials that you can buy in the spring, such as hostas and zinnias and hyacinth and cosmos and marigolds. Many of them might have flower visitors going to those flowers, but if we look at the host plant literature, we find that lots of them have very few and sometimes zero caterpillars that are able to feed on these plants as host plants. So there's some really sharp differences between native and non-native plant species. And in fact, when we look at the literature, when we do a review of some of the quantitative comparisons that have been made out there, we find that on average, native plants are supporting a much higher species diversity of insects compared to non-native species, but they're also supporting a much higher abundance of insects as well, which is what really matters for things like songbirds that feed on them. And some of the biggest differences are found in our most specialized insect species. So the ones that are really feeding on a very low number of plants are much less likely to be able to use non-native plants. And just to put some numbers on some of these comparisons, our own work has found that native plants are supporting about 5 times more caterpillar species compared to non-native species, and about 2 to 3 times higher caterpillar abundance and biomass, which again is what really matters for the things that eat caterpillars, like our songbirds. One of the things that I've seen come up in horticultural conversations is about whether it really matters if a plant is if a plant is very closely related to our native species. Does that matter? Does that matter if it's non-native? And there are some folks out there that have said, well, you know, if a cherry is really closely related to our native cherries, they're probably fine. And so another way of saying this is, in ecology, we call them congeners, so non-native congeners. But another way of thinking about it is non-native cousins. So these are plants that are very closely related to our native species, but have been imported from other countries, such as Norway maple, that is very closely related to our red and sugar maples, Kwanzan cherry, that's very closely related to black cherry and choke cherry. The list goes on. There's lots of congeners that have been introduced in horticulture. And so the question is really, well, if they're so closely related to our native species, shouldn't they be serving the same ecological function? And so I'm here to tell you that no, our data suggests that these non-native cousins are inferior compared to the native species. And we do have some numbers to put on that. So if we make those direct comparisons between the native species and its non-native cousin, we find that those non-native species are supporting on average about 40% fewer caterpillars and about 50% fewer species. So even if they're maybe better than the ginkgo or the hosta, they're really not serving the same ecological equivalent as the native species that are being replaced. And so we've had lots of folks that are really, kind of made these tight comparisons between native and non-native cherries and native and non-native maples. But when I was working on my postdoc, I had this great opportunity to work with an undergrad, and we were talking about how, when we go out and we look at some of these non-native species, we do find some caterpillars on them. And so we asked ourselves a question. Does it matter from a performance perspective if a caterpillar is feeding on a native or a non-native cherry? Do the ones that feed on native species, do they perform better? And so we did this really nice feeding experiment where we fed Promethea moth caterpillars on 15 different species of cherry trees. And our results are the kind of results that I love, which is I don't have to show you a graph. I can just show you a picture of what those caterpillars look like after 40 days. So in the upper right here, on the left, we have a Promethea moth caterpillar that was feeding on our native black cherry. And so after 40 days of feeding, it was in its last stage. It was ready to pupate. It was ready to turn into that big, beautiful moth that we love. But from the same group of eggs, when we fed that caterpillar on a non-native Yoshino cherry or a Kwanzan cherry or a other kind double flowering cherry, we had so many species of cherries that we tested. When we feed them these non-native cousins, they're in such earlier, even after 40 days, they're in very early stages. And so when we calculated the numbers, what we found is that those caterpillars that were feeding on non-native cherries suffered a higher mortality, so they were more likely to die. And they also had a slower growth as well. And so this is what this work has really pointed to, is that even if you see a caterpillar being able to feed on some of these non-native cousins, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's performing its full life cycle and being able to pupate. And in fact, that caterpillar that I took a picture of on this Yoshino cherry, it eventually died. And so the performance of these caterpillars on these non-natives is much lower than the performance that we see on the native species that they're actually adapted to. And in some ways, these could actually be ecological traps, which is almost worse than not using them at all. So that's some of the evidence that we have comparing native or non-native species. So if you're on board for planting native species, one of the next questions you might have is, well, which plant species or groups of species should I be focusing on? And that's been a portion of my postdoctoral work, which was really to synthesize a lot of the observations that community scientists and backyard hobbyists and other entomologists have done over the last 100 years. And so after I finished my PhD with Doug Tallamy, I was working with Kimberly Shropshire, which is another person in his lab that's worked with him with many years. And I had the really wonderful opportunity to work with her on putting together this incredible data set across the United States of more than 24,000 observations of caterpillars observed feeding on particular plants. And so we wanted to use this incredible data set, and this is across the entire continental United States, to really ask some simple questions. Are there some plants that are better than others for supporting caterpillars? And we did find, when we started to look at that data, that there were actually a very small number of plants that were power performers in the food web. And so when we look at these numbers, we found that about 14% of the plant genera across the United States are able to support more than 90% of the butterflies and moths that are out there during their caterpillar stage. And so it was very clear that there was some skew that was happening in these interaction data sets, and that we could potentially start thinking about what are the actual identities of these plants that are performing the lion's share of supporting these caterpillars out there. And so this is just to give you an example of some of the power performers that are that occur. This is for New York and Connecticut. So across those two states, there's more than 2,700 butterflies and moths. Lots of diversity. There's a lot of potential to support diversity in these two states. And so the top plants on average are native trees and shrubs are the ones that tend to support more of that butterfly and moth diversity that's out there. And so we have things like oaks that are supporting 526 caterpillar species, cherries at 461, willows at 440, birches, aspens, blueberries. And then for our herbaceous plants, we have things like goldenrod, aster, strawberry, sunflowers, and horse nettle that are supporting over 100 or almost 100 species. And so these were really, for this particular area, were really the power performers, the top plants of supporting caterpillar diversity. But what we noticed is that when we started to look at the numbers and compare the numbers that were in New York and Connecticut to the numbers that were in Minnesota, to the numbers that were in California, to the numbers that were in Texas, we started to see that even with some differences between different areas, that there were some plants that consistently came out on top as being these top performers. And when we did our calculations across 25 states across the United States, we found that there were about 20 tree genera. So these are groups of tree species that contributed above average to these plant caterpillar interactions using a variety of metrics that we used. So it didn't matter if you were in New York or California, oaks were really a great choice to have because they were doing the lion's share of supporting that caterpillar diversity that's out there. And when we published this paper, we called these plants keystone plants because, like in architecture, that keystone, it's what's really supporting that arch. And so we can think about this same concept in food webs is that we need, in addition to increasing plant diversity, which is important for resilience, and supporting diversity and all those wonderful things, we also need to prioritize these keystone plants, which are really doing a lot of the heavy lifting of supporting the architecture of that food web. And so in our simulations, we found that prioritizing these keystone plants in addition to prioritizing plant diversity was the best strategy for supporting the conservation of caterpillars and food webs across the United States. So that's some of the evidence for why both native plants and keystone plants are important. So you may be asking, well, where can I find some of these plants so that I can include them in my yards and my gardens? And so here are some websites that you might be able to visit in order to get some ideas. I'm adding the National Audubon Society, which you can put in your zip code. You can get lists of native plants. The Native Plant Finder is also available, although it does need some work, and I will admit that, but you can also put in your zip code and you can get information about the number of caterpillar species that different plants support so that you can make some kind of direct comparisons between different plants that you might be interested in. So both of those websites are available to do some searching. Another website that you might be interested in is the Homegrown National Park website. Has a lot of handouts that they've created for different ecoregions across the United States based on our data. And so you can put in your different areas. This is the keystone plants for the Northeast, and you can get identities of some of those plants that you might want to prioritize in your planting. And so all of that information based from that paper is available for you to use in your planting decisions. So I'm going to switch now from talking about caterpillars, although I'm happy to answer any questions at the end about that research, and talk a little bit more about nectar and pollen plants. And for a lot of folks that are putting together their gardens, they're really thinking about that. They want to see beautiful flowers, and they're putting in lots of flowers so that they can see wonderful pollinators visiting their garden. But when you're planting for pollinators, one thing that I really hope that you take from this talk is to know that in the eastern United States, well, really across the United States, many of our bee species are what we consider pollen specialists. And so what that means is they don't just collect any pollen in order to feed their young. They really key in on particular plant species, and they're specialized to those plant species in order to raise their young and keep their populations going. I had a colleague once that told me that pollen specialist bees are really just caterpillars of the air. They're really just Hymenoptera, or they're really just caterpillars in disguise. And I really like that that description because there's many bees that are these pollen specialists in the eastern United States. About 25% of them are pollen specialists. And we also have many bees as well that have very strong flower preferences as well over the season. They don't just go to any flower that's in the landscape. They're really choosing the ones that have the high nutrition that they need in order to raise their broods. And so we can kind of apply those same ideas about plant specialization that we did for the caterpillars, we can apply those same ideas to pollen specialist bees. So in the eastern United States, about 25% of our native bees are specialists. So that works out to be at about 180 species of bees. In our bee species, many times our pollen specialism is one bee to one plant. So that occurs much more often than it does in caterpillars to their host plants. But we can add up the number of bees that are found on different groups of plant species and see, are there some that are really supporting a lot of those pollen specialists? And so I got this data from the Native Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab through USGS. And we can look at things like goldenrods are supporting about 34 species of pollen specialists. Sunflowers are supporting about 34. Asters are supporting 29. Black-eyed Susans, we've got willows, coreopsis, blueberries. These were the ones that were really supporting the highest number of these pollen specialist bees. And I put these stars next to blueberries, willows, asters, sunflowers, and goldenrod to really highlight that many of these plant groups that turned out to be really, important for supporting high diversity of pollen specialists are the ones that also pop up in our analyses as being important caterpillar plants as well. So you're really kind of having a double whammy here if you're planting willow species, because those willows are supporting caterpillars, they're supporting food for birds, they're supporting pollen specialists, they're also supporting pollen at a really key period of time, which is the early season when it's much more limited. So thinking about how these plants can serve these multiple benefits to our biodiversity can be a really valuable perspective as well. But one thing that is very strongly likely is that all of these plants that are supporting our pollen specialist bees are also going to support our generalist species as well. And so we've started to actually dig into that data a little bit here in Vermont. So this is using a data set of more than 20,000 different observations of all the bee species that are in Vermont across all the families of plants in Vermont. And you can see that these ones with the darker colors are the ones that are supporting much more of those interactions, those flower visitations. And so when I highlighted things like asters and goldenrods and sunflowers as supporting most of our pollen specialist bees, well, it turns out that they're also supporting lots of the other stuff as well. But I would argue that thinking about our plant management geared towards the pollen specialists, which are often the ones that are the most vulnerable and the ones in the steepest decline, is a really great strategy that's also going to support the rest of that pollinator community as well. So this is a data set that we're just starting to dig into. This is just a preliminary graph for the state of Vermont. And in fact, since this graph has been made, we've added about 40,000 more observations to this data set, and we can start to account for things like species abundance and diversity and observation bias. So we have a lot more work that we need to do, but at least in the preliminary stages, it does sort of point to the idea that these plants for pollen specialists are also the ones that are supporting the most diversity as well. I will strongly acknowledge, or I definitely acknowledge that scientists are slow. So you'll have to wait a little bit for that work to be finalized and published. But in the meantime, we have enough information to know that planting for specialist bees is a good idea. And Cornell University, as well as the Xerces Society, has some really great resources available for you to help in that design process on how you can create pollinator gardens for specialist bees. So I encourage you to check out both of those websites and dig into some of those resources in the meantime. In addition to specialist bees, we can also think about nectar plants for migratory species. So I'm back to the butterflies again. I can't help it. So one of the other one of the other wonderful things that we learned about monarch butterflies is that they go through this really unique migration where they spend the winter in Mexico. The first generation lays their eggs on milkweed in Texas. The young of that generation then moves up a little further north. The young of that generation crosses the Appalachians into the upper Northeast. And then the fourth generation is really the one that migrates down south back to spend the winter in Mexico. And then that starts the cycle all over again. And so, there's been some great attention to, well, we need to think about how we can support nectar plants and nutritious nectar plants for these monarch butterflies so that they can continue on that really high level, high endurance migration that they need to make to get to Mexico. And that is true. But one thing that isn't quite brought to attention is that monarch butterflies are not the only butterflies that migrate. And in fact, 12% of our butterflies in the United States are migratory. And so that works out to about 90 different species of butterflies across the United States are making journeys. Not all of them are completing a two-way cycle quite like the monarch is, but they are making really long distance movements in order to seed new generations in new places. And they're also flying during these periods where nectar resources are really limited, such as in the early spring and the late fall. And in addition to butterflies, there are lots of other insects that are migratory as well, including our hoverflies, which are really important pollinators for our gardens, but also for things like high elevation alpine ecosystems and really sensitive habitats. And scientists are really at the infancy of starting to understand how these migrations are occurring in these other insect species. But regardless, we know that in order to make these long distance migratory movements, they need these nutritious plants, these nutritious nectar plants. And so when you're thinking about your plantings, thinking about how you can support these migratory species as well can be a wonderful strategy for supporting insect species that may not necessarily stick around in your area, but you might be providing those pathways in order for it to move north and south. And so some of the suggestions in the literature for supporting these migratory species is to maintain a diverse flowering phenology. And so that has included, one of the suggestions that I've seen around is to try to maintain at least 3 flowering plants at all times. And for these insects that are moving in the early spring and the late fall, we want to prioritize those flowers during those times in the annual cycle where nectar and pollen is most limited. So prioritizing those early spring and the late fall can be a really great strategy. So if you're like me, you're starting to pack up for the winter, you're starting to get things ready. But this is a really great time to think about what flowers that you might want to plant next year. And part of the reason for that is because many of our native wildflower species need to spend the winter in a winter stratification period. They need to go through that cold cycle in order to sprout in the spring. And really growing plants from seed is a much cheaper way than buying them established in their pots. And so I had a lot of fun. I actually just started doing this on my own, is planting lots of native wildflower seeds in the fall and then watching them come out the next spring. And I got a lot of really great advice from the Wild Seed Project, which is a nonprofit in Maine. They have a lot of really great planting advice for how to grow native wildflowers from seed. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. The last bit that I want to talk about here is to talk about nesting and overwintering habitat and the importance of this in your yard management. And one of the biggest things that you can do, in addition to creating, host plants and flowers and all these great things, is to think about how you can keep diverse microhabitats for nesting. If we look across bees, just to use bees as an example, more than 90% of our bees are nesting underground or nesting in dead trees and stems. And about 70% of those bees are nesting in the ground. So when we think about like the colonies of honeybees or the colonies of bumblebees, that's like 1% of the bees that are out there. Most of our bees are solitary species that are nesting in the ground. And they use a lot of diverse nesting locations. They use some species like sandy soils, some species like clay. There's lots of different, and scientists are still learning about what these nesting locations, what's important for different species. And so one of the things that's really been suggested for creating a habitat for some of these ground nesting bees is to think about how you can maintain bare ground within your garden space. And I know that probably seems like, well, wait a minute, bare ground isn't habitat, but it actually really is, and it can be really important habitat. Some of our sandy soil specialist bees are some of the ones that are the most imperiled. And so we can create gardens that have spaces for them to nest, as well as those nectar and pollen resources as well. Another really important aspect about creating nesting habitat for bees in these gardens is the use of mulch. And so I would encourage you to think about how you can either go mulch free or mulch differently. And the reason for that is when you add those really big chunks of mulch into your garden landscape, you're actually inhibiting many of our small bee species from making nests. They're just unable to get within that mulch. And so even if you see them visiting their flowers, they're not able to actually initiate the broods that they need to in your habitat. So you're not actually supporting the population, you're just supporting foraging resources. And so I would encourage you to avoid using mulch if you can, or you can also think about what some alternative types of mulch might be, such as using shredded leaves or smaller pieces that are easier for bees to get through. So that sort of thinks about some of the species that are using ground nesting. But about 20 to 30% of our bees are also nesting in dead and living trees and stems. And so you can keep habitat for those 20 to 30% of bee species by just being lazier in your gardening habitats. And that could include leaving dead logs, leaving snags, or leaving dead flower stalks after those plants have senesced. And those will provide those locations for the stem nesting bees to use the next year when they initiate their broods. The other suggestion that you might want to think about is whether you can incorporate some of these plants that have really pithy stems like raspberry and Joe Pyeweed, because those can attract some species that then dig out those piths so that they can create their nest in those plants as well. I had an arrowwood viburnum that it was in my yard that was pruned before I bought it, and the bees were able to go into those prune locations and then actually put their nests inside of there, which is really cool. So those are some of the ideas that you might want to take. There's also talk about using bee hotels, but honestly, in my experience, they don't really. They mostly are attracting wasps and non-native species. But the most important thing is, just like something like a bird feeder or a birdhouse, if you're going to have these bee hotels, you need to make sure that they're cleaned out regularly and they're free of pesticides and all of these things. You want to make sure that that's good habitat. And it's honestly just easier to maintain the plant communities to create nesting habitat or the bare ground than to actually keep up with the maintenance with these bee hotels. So for these kind of nesting and overwintering locations, one of the big action items that's out there is to leave the leaves. And, when we leave these, the leaf litter after the trees have dropped all their leaves, that can support amazing variety of species and parts of the life cycle. So things like our queen bumblebees spend the winter, they overwinter in that leaf litter, and they need those right microclimates in order to survive those cold winters and come out the next year. Many of our butterflies and moths that feed on our trees, they actually go to the ground in order to pupate, like our Luna moth. And so in addition to having the trees that they need to feed on, we need to have that leaf litter underneath for them to put their cocoons so that they can complete that life cycle. There are some insect species that are out there that actually use dead leaf litter as a food resource. Some of those things are detritivores like millipedes and some beetles. But there's even a butterfly, the red-banded hairstreak, that only feeds on dead leaves as a caterpillar. And in fact, that species not only feeds on dead leaves, it only feeds on dead oak leaves. So that leaf litter can be really important as food resources for many insect species as well. And I can't help myself. I have to mention that for many of our songbird species, this leaf litter is also a winter buffet for them. So as these insects are spending the winter in this leaf litter in order to initiate the next populations next year, those songbirds are actually coming in and finding a lot of these insects, and it's really critical protein for thermoregulation and for molt and all these important life history events in the winter for birds as well. So this leaf litter can provide a lot of really important habitat that honestly hasn't really been recognized as much as some of these other decisions that you make. And the last thing that I just want to say about leaf litter is that there's some great new research by a colleague of mine, Karen Burkhart, that has actually tested these assumptions about whether leaving the leaves has a benefit to ecological services. And she found that not only are these assumptions supported by the data, so we actually do support more insects, but her student also found that leaving the leaves stores more carbon, and it also provides a lot of key ecosystem services like decomposition as well. So in addition to supporting the wonderful wildlife that we want, we're also doing all these other great things as well. And then the last thing that I just want to mention here is the idea of cultivating soft landings. And so some people kind of think about, well, I don't want to see all this leaf litter out there. Well, there is something you can do about that. You can think about how you can cultivate these soft landings, which are natural areas under trees that are filled with native plants, as well as other organic materials like leaf litter and duff. And Heather Holm, who you might know from her books on pollinators, has some wonderful lists of native species that are well adapted to thrive in shaded conditions under trees. And so I encourage you to check out this idea of soft landings and see what kind of plants that you can plant under your trees as well. So that's most of what I have to present to you today. So, just to go over some of the things that I talked about, some of the important gardening actions that you can take for pollinators across the year includes planting important host plants. And so that includes planting native species as well as our keystone species. We want to think about plant identity when we're planting for flower visiting insects, and that includes thinking really strategically about our specialist bees, as well as planting diverse flowering times for both our resident species as well as our migratory ones as well. And then finally, to think about how we can increase and promote nesting and overwintering locations by keeping a diversity of places where these pollinators can breed, as well as cultivating soft landings, leaving the leaves, and things like that. But I always want to emphasize that if we're going to invite these insect pollinators into our yards, we want to also, if we're going to provide the resources for them, we also want to reduce our hazards as well. So thinking about how we can minimize or eliminate pesticides and practice climate-friendly actions are always going to be part of the solution, in addition to all these wonderful gardening actions as well. So that's that's all of the kind of actions that I wanted to highlight. But I just want to end this talk here with just a real quick plug for how you can get involved in community science with me here at VCE right now, especially if you're in California or in the Northeast. Some of you here may be familiar with the website iNaturalist. If you're not familiar with it, it's this wonderful community science platform where you can upload pictures of different insects, birds, trees, you name it. Any living thing that you observe, you can upload it to this website, and you can crowdsource identifications of that organism so that you can start to meet your neighbors and learn about some of the organisms that are using your property or your pathway. And so this is an example of a bee species that I saw exploring some of the sandy habitat in my backyard. And so I uploaded it. I said, I think this is a cellophane bee. And lo and behold, just a couple of days later, the world expert on bees helped me identify it, that it's an unequal cellophane bee. So it's a great way to document the occurrence of different pollinator species that are using your properties or places that you like to go. And so what we're doing is harnessing this iNaturalist platform. And I like to say we're taking iNaturalist to the next level. And that is because when we submit an observation about a pollinator, in many cases, we're not just documenting the occurrence of a species, we're also documenting interactions as well. And so this is an example of a Canadian tiger swallowtail I took a picture of. And so I documented that this species existed in that area, but I'm also documenting that this species was visiting northern blue flag iris as well. And so in iNaturalist, you can add fields that will actually highlight that interaction so that scientists can then use that data to ask ecological questions, or rather to answer ecological questions that they might have about plant-animal interactions. And so this can be done on new observations that you've done. It also can be done by going back to observations that you made before and annotating them if you can identify the plant in that picture. And so we started a project within iNaturalist. It's called the Pollinator Interactions on Plants Project, or the PIP project for short. It's taken off. It's focused on the Northeast. So this is New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. We're starting in that area for right now. And just in a short 2 years, we have amassed over 140,000 observations of pollinators on plants that are not just identified as an interaction occurring, but they also have a specific location and a specific time as well. And so this is a level of precision of plant-animal interactions that hasn't been synthesized for this area at this level before. And so this is just what we have started to sort of synthesize for the Northeast, but anyone can add these fields no matter where you are in the country. And what's so great about adding this interaction field to your data is that then those observations are then put into the pipeline to be synthesized into other data sets. So we can take our 140,000 observations here for the Northeast. When we start to put in the other observations from published papers, from other data sets, we're actually at almost 250,000 observations. So it's an incredible data set. If you'd like to join this project and start adding your own observations, you can go to this QR code and you can go straight to our project and join it and start adding it. Lots of folks like taking pictures of pollinators, and we've definitely made a lot of progress there. I gotta say, I also made a project on caterpillar host plants. Not as many people are using that one, but if you like to take pictures of caterpillars, you can do the same thing. And by adding the host plant and adding it to our sister project, which is the caterpillar and sawfly host plants of the Northeast US. And so what's so wonderful about this opportunity within iNaturalist is that we are able to collect data at a scale that has never really been seen before. So when I was putting together my caterpillar data sets to identify keystone plants, I mean, in just a few short years, it's just like, wow, that was like bare bones compared to what we can do now. So if you'd like to start thinking of, not just identifying the species that are in your yard, but really getting some data about what plants that they're choosing, that can be really helpful for our community science work. And the whole reason that we're doing this, I don't do community science projects unless I have a good reason for doing it. The reason that we're doing it is to actually develop and implement a better native plant selection tool. And so we're starting, we're amassing this big data set so that we can identify what plant traits or identities are really boosting biodiversity. How does landscape context and local conditions impact those interactions? But ultimately, we want to be able to provide you a tool that you can take those decisions that you're making, such as, I have acidic soil and I have pink flowers and it's kind of shaded and I really like butterflies. What plants might be best for this location in Connecticut? That's the kind of tool that we're hoping to put together. We're starting with the Northeast, and I also have colleagues that are working on this in California. But the time is now to add your observations. And I just wanted to end that little plug by just recognizing just the incredible footprint that the Pollinator Pathways folks have across the United States. And so this is just like a wonderful opportunity to not just increase our knowledge, but to increase our impact. And so I hope that you'll really think about how you can not just cultivate and tend to your pathway, but also think about how it can contribute to our science to better these ecosystems as well. That's all that I have for you. I know I said a lot, and I definitely went more than I meant to. But if any of this was interesting to you, you can definitely go to my website. You can download any of these papers. You can get any of the graphics that I offered here. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have. Thanks so much for listening to all of that.
You're muted, Donna. Uh-oh. Donna, you're muted. Can you unmute?
Oh, there we go.
There she is.
Thank you so much. I mean, Desiree, I could have listened to you for another hour. I didn't even notice the time going by. So it was fantastic. And
thank you.
we're all on board with your science. And
great.
Louise, as the editor here, has got everybody's questions. And I imagine there's a number of them, Louise, right?
There are so many questions. I'll try to just get started quickly. So there was a question, what is the favorite plant of the Attalus butterfly? Attala. Could you repeat that one?
Oh, sure. So the Attala butterfly, it is a specialist of like Florida ecosystems, and it uses the Kunti plant, which, I wish that I knew the genus right off the top of my head, but I'm going to look it up for you. It's Zamia. So that's the genus, and there's a couple of species within there. So if you want to, you're not going to get it if you live in Connecticut or California. But if you do live in Florida, you have a great chance of getting it by planting these Zamia plants.
It's
kind of like a fern.
Okay, I'm going to race. Dr. Narango, your chickadee study is so important. Thank you. But I wonder if it's overgeneralizing from one study of one species that 30% non-native plants is fine, as people often conclude from it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I didn't present the the chickadee stuff during this talk, but if I was presenting it, I would present this caveat. And we do this in the paper as well, which is to say that this is an urban, chickadees are an urban adapted species. And so we can conclude from this is that if we want to support these species of high conservation concern, we got to do better. And so, and I've also talked to some colleagues in California. So I have a colleague named Eric Wood. He's at Cal State LA, and he's doing some similar studies on species there to see if some of the patterns that we see from the Northeast are also occurring out West. He has a couple of papers that have come out already that both agree with what we found and also go beyond. So one of the things that he found is that even for birds in the winter, that native plants are super important, and for birds during migration. So while this is one of the things with science, we need to have model species. While I would love to study scarlet tanagers and cardinals and, everything, but we need to start somewhere, and it's really hard to study the most sensitive species in these habitat because they're not there. And so, I agree with you. This is sort of how science works, is to not just hinge all your decisions on this one chickadee paper, but to think about that paper as different pieces of this big puzzle. And that is one, big piece of evidence of the impact of native plants on insectivorous bird populations. But that's not the end all be all. There's no magic bullet. Like you get to 70% and suddenly everything is okay. And I am 100%, will say that to anyone that asks me that. Hopefully that, that makes sense.
Okay. Do bumblebees go back to winter where they were born? I guess, do they use the same holes, the same underground nests, or?
Oh,
good question, right?
Gosh, I wish I knew that. The answer is likely no, but, to be honest, we know almost nothing about what bumblebees. So first of all, let me take a step back. So the queens that overwinter are not the same ones that overwintered the year before. That's the daughters of the ones that overwintered the year before. They probably are looking for similar things. And scientists suspect that there are particular microclimates and particular context that these bees are really looking for. But honestly, we don't know. And I've gone out looking for, there's this thing, it was a community science project. It was like Queen Blitz or something to find these overwintering queens. And I spent 3 days looking for queens, and I found one. And that was amazing, right? So yeah, no, it's I wish I could tell you exactly what they're looking for, but I don't know that. And so the best that we can do is we know that they're using leaf litter. They're probably using trees because the temperature is often higher around roots. And so it's really natural ecosystems. I can tell you what they're not using, which is lawn, pavement, things like that. So I don't know. Hopefully that helps.
Okay. All right. Have you done any research related to butterfly bush? I have many neighbors and garden clubs in love with butterfly bush.
Oh, yeah.
Is it the larvae do not get good nutrition and die? Are there chemicals in the plant that kill them? Buddleia is what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, Buddleia. Yeah. So in many of my projects, butterfly bush has been one component of the non-native plants that are out there. It is very popular, like very popular. I will tell you that from a caterpillar's perspective, there's like not very much on it at all. There's very few caterpillar species that use butterfly bush as a host plant. And, because of that, there's not very many predatory arthropods. Because of that, there's not very many birds that are foraging on them. I'm not saying the answer is zero, but it's not very much. But the one thing that people do observe pretty readily on butterfly bush is that it does attract butterflies, and it does attract other flower visiting insects. And to be perfectly honest, I've spent more time of my life, of my research life, thinking about caterpillars. And so for the last 2 or 3 years, I've been really kind of thinking about flower visitation more often. And we did this study in Westchester County, Connecticut, or New York and Fairfield County, Connecticut, where we went into people's yards and we looked at plant-animal interactions in different landscape contexts. And lots of people had butterfly bush and they said, oh, it's so beautiful. It's attracting all these pollinators. Well, here's the thing. When you look at the identities of the pollinators that are using it from an entomology perspective, they're very boring. It's the same stuff. It's common eastern bumblebee. It's tiger swallowtail. It's honeybees. And so that's not, I mean, clearly they're supporting some species that are visiting them, but from a conservation perspective, they're not supporting the bee species that need the resources. So the specialist bees, the ones of conservation concern, the vulnerable species are nowhere near butterfly bush. And so that's sort of what we started to look at these comparisons between different plants and between different yards, is not just thinking about diversity or activity or abundance, but really thinking about the identities of the bees that are being supported. Are you really making a difference, or is it just giving you a false sense of security that you're supporting lots of pollinators because you see this big gaudy, tiger swallowtail that's going to it? So this is a long-winded way of me saying that, no, I don't think butterfly bush is a great species for pollinators. And that's the reason why, is because it really matters what communities are using different plants.
This is kind of follows from that. If we choose a plant that supports a lot of pollinators, how do we know that we have the right insects in our yard for the plants we pick?
Is the question about non-native invasive
Just
insect
that
species or about availability?
Yeah, how do they know what to plant? Like, do you need to know what insects are there first before you choose a plant? I think.
Yeah. If there's a particular insect that you really like, by all means, think about choosing that plant. So, for instance, like for me, I have a Bombus fervidus, which is a state threatened bumblebee. And so I'm always thinking about what can I do for that bumblebee species? But I think in many cases, the same plants that are supporting high diversity of species are also supporting those vulnerable ones as well. And so I think we don't want, I like to say this a lot, like perfection is the enemy of the good. You don't want to think too deep about the nuance of like, well, what insects are here? And then I'm going to plant for them. You want to think about what you can attract, because this is so cheesy. If you plant it, they will come. That's one of the cool things about insects is that they respond in really short time scales. So we don't need to wait a long time to see if it's working. Sure, if you're in downtown New York City, you're going to have a lot of trouble, attracting those species. But, we did some restoration gardens in schools in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I will never forget, they planted, oh, now I can't remember. I think it was like heartleaf aster in these things. And they planted this garden. And after we're like, yay, we did it. What a hard day. We planted it. And lo and behold, a butterfly flew in and a female oviposited on one of those plugs that they had planted less than an hour ago.
Oh my God.
It was like, obviously this is not a published paper here. This is just an anecdote, but it's like, it's those kinds of things, is that, rather than think about what's there, think about what you could have. And you can connect with different folks like your extension agency or like a university for your local area and see like, what should I be thinking about for my property? Because if you live in a forested ecosystem, like up here in Vermont, you might be thinking about a different strategy than if you're living in like the prairies of Iowa. So I would definitely encourage you to think and reach out to those experts in your local areas to sort of think about like what a great strategy is, but not worry about what's there now. Think about what you want to bring there.
Okay, Desiree, you mentioned the effects of non-native cousins on caterpillar development and mortality. Have you come across any research or gathered data yourself on caterpillar performance and cultivars or nativars?
Yes. So when I was a PhD student at University of Delaware, helped a graduate student with her her master's work, and it was asking that exact question. It was, do the wild straight species perform better or similar to these native cultivars or these nativars? And so we tested about 12 different species of woody trees and shrubs that differed from the straight species for a variety of different traits, such as are they a dwarf variety? Do they support more fruit? Are they disease resistant? So, you know, because these cultivars can be cultivated for like lots of different reasons. And so, at least from the plant eating insects perspective, so like herbivores, like caterpillars, most cultivars performed as well as the straight species, except for when you changed the color of the leaf. Like if you chose like forest pansy redbud, which has those like big red leaves instead of the green leaves, well, that makes perfect sense, because when you change the color of the leaf, when you select for red leaves, you're selecting for a different leaf chemistry. And so we did see a strong negative impact when there were red or blue or purple leaves. But that was the only trait that had a strong signal. And I know that there's been some studies looking at flower visitation on different cultivars. I don't see many of those studies published. And I suspect that part of the reason for that is that they're not finding strong differences. That's my honest opinion. And in many cases, some of the conclusions from these flower visitation studies is that it really depends on the cultivar, because for some cultivars, like phlox, the cultivar is actually better because you're selecting for more flowers. Whereas for other cultivars like hydrangea, you're selecting for a flower that the pollinators can't access. So I guess what I would say is that we need better design studies that are actually looking at the traits and not the identities of the cultivars. There's never been a designed study that I've liked that has tested that in a really well done way for flower visitation. But from a plant conservation perspective and from like a plant resilience perspective, cultivars are clones. And so if there could be a disease that comes in and wipes out all of your mop head hydrangeas. I don't know, so if you can, it's better to go for the straight species from a resilience perspective. Whether that translates into pollinator support depends on the traits for caterpillars and other plant-eating insects, and likely depends on the traits for flower visiting insects as well, but we need more studies. And it may be that cultivars just need to be evaluated on a cultivar by cultivar basis, and that's going to be really challenging. So hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, we have just so many questions. We're not going to get to them all, but this is another good one from Michelle Detweiler. Are there biological genetic reasons why the same genera that best support caterpillars as host plants also support specialist bees?
Oh, that's such a good question.
That's a good
I don't
question.
know the answer to that. So to be perfectly honest, we don't know the mechanism for why some plants are keystone plants. So that usually comes up in these talks, is like, well, why are oaks so good? And then we can come up with lots of different hypotheses for why that might be. It could be chemical, it could be evolutionary, it could be geographic. They're just there's lots of them everywhere. And those same sort of mechanisms could also influence bees in a very similar way. And the best I can say is that I have a grant right now to try to test some of these mechanisms of why some plants are better than others. So if anybody has a phone call to NSF, tell them to fund it, and I would love to answer that question for you. I would suspect that a lot of this has to do with availability in the landscape, and that some of these plants, like if we think about like historically, asters and goldenrods are dominant species from a flowering perspective. And so it makes sense that a lot of species would adapt to use them. And in every ecosystem, some species partition out into a generalist strategy, and some of them partition out into a specialist strategy. So, you know, but there could also be nutritional things, and that's something that we just need to explore more. There is some folks that dig a little deeper into pollination ecology than I do, have suggested that you know, things like sunflowers and asters and goldenrods have the perfect like lipid to protein ratio for growing baby bees. And so why that happened, that it might also have the right nitrogen ratio for caterpillars is a big overarching evolutionary question.
Okay, can you do a couple more?
Oh, I will stay here all night. I don't care.
Okay, all right. I see people, we still have hundreds of people here. So
Okay.
I see people on social media encouraging others to shop for native seeds all over the country, sometimes nowhere near where they live. How would you go about explaining to folks the importance of buying local seed to start your native gardens? Another good question.
Another plant, Louise, you know. So I'm very excited to tell you that I have that same question. Well, so I have questions personally about the importance of plant provenance. So plant provenance or provenance, depending on who you talk to, is the geographic origin of plant material, or like seed or plugs or whatever. And so for most people, especially up here in the Northeast, if you go to your local nursery, none of the plants that are available for you to buy were actually grown in the Northeast and are Northeast genetic material. So from a plant conservation perspective, it makes a lot of sense to plant local genotypes because they are adapted to the local ecosystems. They are similar genetic phenotypes to the local species. You're not introducing non-local, you know, there's all these potential introductions, etc. I'm not a botanist, but for the plant conservation folks, there's a lot of evidence in that department. But truthfully, there's no evidence for the Northeast that local provenance plants are better for pollinators. And we actually just got a grant for a 3-year study to test that exact question. And so we have 6 gardens up here in the Northeast that are planted with seeds that were sourced from 3 different ecoregions, so that we can compare them in a common garden experiment to see whether some plants are better than whether local plants are better than non-local plants. I couldn't help myself. I have to plug this experiment because I'm so excited about it. So the answer is, come talk to me in 2 years, and I'll have I'll have the evidence for what the answer to that question really is. But from a plant resilience perspective, and from just like a low carbon perspective, it makes a lot of sense to buy local and to source local seeds, than to be shipping these plants all around the country. But truthfully, it's really, really hard to get local material. And so I hesitate to, again, perfection is the enemy of the good. And I hesitate to discourage people from making good steps, because they might find, if you're like, well, you have to buy local ecotypes, and they're like, well, I can't find any, so I'm not going to do anything. We don't want that to happen. But, you know, there are steps towards the right decisions. And so if you have local ecotypes available, amazing, like go for it. And share that knowledge for why it's important. But in many cases, it's going to be super hard for folks to find those plants, or it's going to be really expensive. Up here in the Northeast, we are having a big problem because the demand for native plants is so high that the supply chain can't keep up with it. And so, you know, do you want people to not do anything? No. But there is evidence that from a from a plant resilience perspective, we should be focusing on it. And so hopefully we'll have some evidence that it matters for pollinators too.
Okay, cool. All right. I'm going to combine a bunch of bare ground questions because there were a lot that came in all together. Define bare ground is one. And then one is we have a layer of mulch from years past. Do we leave it or remove it? One is, are pine needles a good choice as mulch? And one is, what about wood chips as ground cover, at least until plants are thick enough to deter invasives and unwanted plants? So all of those,
Yeah.
what are we talking about with the bare ground?
Okay, so just to address the bare ground, so bare ground is another way to think about it is to think about having some heterogeneity in your garden space so that not every single location is completely covered with plant material. So you might find like cellophane bees and some adrena, like they'll locate an area that is just like sandy. It's just sandy, bare soil. And that's what they're looking for their nesting location. So I'm not saying, you know, X amount of land should be set aside as nesting habitat. It's really about thinking about these diverse kind of locations so that you can try to maximize that you're supporting, you know, lots of species that you can. And so, you know, in many, I mean, in the simplest terms, bare ground is just, it's bare area that's not pavement, it's permeable surface that's not covered in vegetation. What was the other part of the question? It was
what about wood chips and pine straw? Are they
wood chips, yeah, wood chips and pine straw. Um, so I guess I would emphasize that your garden or your yard, it has to work for you too, right? And we're all on a journey. And you're not going to do everything perfect right away. And so let's say you already put wood chips down. Well, you can think about, do you need that many wood chips? Maybe you can take some of them out. It's going to take a long, long time for them to decompose in many cases. And so you might be able to take some of them out so that some bees are able to like get through it. I have heard that pine needles is an attractive alternative that might work. I don't know that personally, but I know some nursery managers have suggested that. So that could be something you could try. You could have that there's some plants where you really need to have some like non-ideal situation to get them established, and then you can make, you know, then you can change things as you go. But really one of the best things that you can do is to think about some part of your yard that you're setting aside for biodiversity, and it's natural and it's allowed to do what it's gonna do. Like I get in a similar vein, I get a lot of questions about mowing. What's the perfect mowing, or when's the perfect time to get rid of dead stems? And the answer is there's no perfect time. At all points of time, you could possibly be doing something wrong for some species. But it is helpful to think about some area of your property that you just let it be natural. And then it's okay to have some part of your property that you keep for you. And if that means that you have a little bit of mulch there because you like the way it looks, or it's working to help you establish those native plants so that they can outcompete those invasives, that's okay, because we're all on a journey. It's just thinking about, well, how can we incrementally improve what we've got here?
There are a bunch of questions about whether or not this is being recorded, and it is, and it will be available on the Pollinator Pathway website and on our YouTube station soon. And I guess we do need to wind down because it's almost 8. There are so many more great questions. I'm sorry, we're going to have to, I guess, have you back so that we can do this again.
Well, if I could just put in, I mean, I don't want 300 emails, but one of the wonderful things of why I work at a nonprofit and not at other kinds of institutions is that this is my job, is to help people and help people in their journey. And I'm also really keen to talk to folks about how, you know, a group like yourselves might be interested in participating in community science projects with with your garden spaces that you're already putting a lot of time and work in. So, don't be afraid if you have a question that I didn't get to and it's really on your mind, like feel free to reach out. Like I'm happy to answer questions.
That is really generous. Thank you. Yeah, Donna, do you want to? Uh-oh, you're still muted. Are you having trouble? I'll just wind it up. I don't know. Your mute is still on. We are missing our usual tech person. So I'm a stand-in tech person, and that's what you're seeing. But thank you everybody for coming tonight. And thank you so much, Desiree. That was amazing and learned so much. I was trying to be tech person and take notes and screenshots, and really, really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks everybody for coming and for being on the pollinator pathway and doing this work. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.